Morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Morning, Laurie.
Good morning.
Father. At this time, I would like to entertain a motion to, do we need a motion to come out of recess? General Counsel? Okay.
So moved.
Okay, let me make sure the record's clear. At this time, I'd like to entertain a motion to resume the open session for the LSU Presidential Search Committee. It's been moved by Chancellor Clark. You have a second by Mr. Laborde. Any objection? Seeing none, we will proceed. We'll turn it back over to you, Ms. Wilder.
Good morning to everyone. We're glad to be here. I know we have our first candidate ready to go. So Nicole, if you'll let him back in, that would be outstanding. And you're free to move forward, Mr. Williams.
Thank you. Good morning, sir.
Good morning. How are you all doing today?
Good. My name is James Williams. I'm the chair of the LSU Presidential Search Committee. I'd like to start by asking you to please give us a 5-minute overview of how your experience has prepared you to be president of LSU.
Well, Chair Williams, thank you so much. It's a great question, and it's a deep question, in fact, not just what has my experience taught me, but how has it actually prepared me? And I'd say 3 fundamental things. First of all, character, basically who one is, and the reflection of the values that one holds fairly deeply. The second thing, of course, is experience, what one knows, what they've been taught, what they've experienced over their career. And the third thing is leadership, how one actually applies knowledge and skills. And all these things intertwine. You know, character is the foundation. Experience, of course, is what you gain over a period of time, and that develops leadership. Leadership opens doors to new experiences. That feeds back to strengthening character, and so on and so forth. So all these things intertwine, and everything that I've done, I've learned every step along the way to strengthen my character, strengthen experience, get new experiences, and also strengthen my leadership. So first of all, character. Basically, pure and simple, I love people. I value people. I love working with them. I'm from a very small town, and the values of honesty and integrity and sharing and serving and taking responsibility for one's own action, valuing other people, they're deeply ingrained within me. But also as a scientist, as a researcher, those essentially are the same values that I have as a researcher. Integrity and respect and solving big problems, coming together, and so on. I basically get fed by watching people succeed. I love helping people. I love helping them achieve more than they think is possible. I love opening doors for them. I love finding people who are basically unappreciated or maybe overlooked and releasing that nascent talent in whatever way is possible. Accessibility is a huge priority for me. I drove my White House staff kind of crazy with my accessibility. I'd go to visit universities, I'd have big meetings, whatever. I'd hand out my business card, it had my cell phone on it, my email address, and oh my gosh, you're not supposed to do that. A leader needs to be accessible, and that's true for a university president. You can't build relationships with students, with faculty, with staff, with alumni, unless you are out working with them and among them, both formally and informally. I love discussing people's goals and dreams, and I love solving hard problems. And that's really, I say, the foundation of my character is a very people-oriented person, somebody who really wants to see people advance, institutions advance. My experience, I think you've all seen my CV. I've been in faculty my entire career at a university. I'm almost completing my 36th year now. I understand the academic environment all the way from assistant professor all the way through an executive officer as vice president for research. I've had a lot of grants. I've run a lot of centers. I've taught basically every semester. I value teaching very, very, very highly. And in fact, when I was vice president for research, I kept teaching. It's very, very important for me to be in there teaching, understanding challenges that we have in the classroom and also with faculty, being able to relate to them and all the challenges they face. Fundraising, running large centers. I've had to go out and engage with private industry. In fact, from very early in my career as a presidential young investigator, I was a year into my assistant professorship when I got a grant from NSF that required me to go find matching support from other sources, private industry, donors, and things like that. So I had to learn how to express and explain my scholarly activities in a way that would resonate with them and cause them to want to invest in what I was doing and see the value of it. I've been engaged at the state level as a governor's cabinet member, working closely with the legislature, with the state regents, not only when I was in the cabinet, but before that, and also engaging nationally as a member of the National Science Board for 12 years, which is the governing body of the National Science Foundation, an $8.5 billion agency. Also, as the acting NSF director and as the director of the Office of Science Technology Policy in the White House, I've had a lot of engagement with federal agencies, also testifying before Congress 12 different times. That and kind of folded in with diversity, which is extremely important to me. And it's something that I think about all the time and I really take action on. We'll talk about that later. It's very, very important to me. So that's really, I would say, my experience base. And then the leadership for me is I basically engage others almost to a fault. When I was at the White House, we were working on things related to open access. We were working on research security issues. I would engage university associations. I would go around the country meeting with clusters of universities and regions to get their input, to understand their challenges, understand where they were at, and to harvest their ideas. Because I know places to go to find answers to hard problems. And those individuals are called faculty members. They're very creative. Students are very, very creative. They thrive on solving difficult problems and addressing key challenges. And that's where I go. And I did that as vice president for research, engaging the faculty. I told them, I said, look, I'm an executive officer, but I'm still a faculty member. You and us, we know the problems, right? Help me solve them. Help me identify them, figure out how to solve them so we work holistically and together. And that collaborative spirit is about everything that I do as a leader. I also empower other people. I trust them and I resource them. A leader is not about making all the decisions. I actually started the Faculty Leadership Academy at OU because I felt that faculty really were reluctant to be bolder and bigger in their thinking because they were afraid of being a leader. And a leader is not, I desire to be a provost or a dean. A leader is fundamental tenets of leadership about understanding how to empower and align people, motivate them, resource them, and so on. And that's very, very critical to me as developing leaders as well. So I want to be accessible. I am accessible. People don't fear coming to me. And one of the things that we learned is a culture of fear is a very, very bad thing. And so for me, accessibility and openness and transparency are all very, very critical, as is communication. This is something I learned at the White House, that in the absence of communication, people understandably will basically come up with their own views toward things, their own presumptions based on epsilon, small amounts of information. And usually they're typically wrong, but in some cases you're not able to correct the record and tell them what's really going on. So those are some of the things I would say in terms of my fundamental character, my experience and leadership, and how they all intertwine. And really for me, fundamentally, being at a university means being in this incredible culture where we work together, we collaborate, we respect one another, we solve difficult problems, we debate tough issues with civility, and we act as a family. And those are important values to me that I think, frankly, are, in some sense, we're really losing them in the academic environment. So one of the reasons that I'm so excited about the opportunity at LSU is to, in a presidency, from that particular point of view, that leadership role of actually helping, strengthen those values and also make them part of strengthening our country. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity. And thank you all so much for the hard work you're doing. I've been sitting at the same table you're at. It's a lot of work to do what you're doing, and I appreciate it very deeply. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Gonzalez?
Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
What is your vision for LSU as an 8-institution system, including the LSU Ag Center and health centers? Please describe short and long-term goals and metrics to measure your success.
Dr. Gonzalez, thank you for the question. You're quite an esteemed faculty member. Your reputation is well known as a physicist. I thank you so much for being a part of this activity. There were three things that really attracted me to LSU. One is my historical interaction with it in a variety of ways that we could talk about. But this is the second one, in addition to the third piece, which is really the state of Louisiana and a lot of the similarities it has with Oklahoma and the familiarity I have with those things. But this Dr. Gonzalez, is really, I'd say, one of the key things that attracted me, this 8-institution system. My vision for that is that it would be the national role model for a seamless, multifaceted educational research and services environment. There aren't many of these things around. There are a lot of really great freestanding institutions, maybe that are connected, say, to a four-year college or whatever. The University of Hawaii has sort of a singular system, a lot like the LSU system, but this is quite unique in that it also includes a K-12 school. So when you look at the totality of the system, a lot of the things that we see as challenges, that I've seen as challenges in my career, and especially at the White House, are transition points. So let me talk about the education dimension of this. Transition points from career tech, let's start with high school and K-12, that system primary education to secondary education and post-secondary education, those transition points are very, very difficult. And it's not a well woven together system. It's not seamless at all. There are a lot of breakpoints, and it's a lot of people have a lot of difficulty sometimes moving from segment to segment in there. And it's not that there aren't articulation agreements and things like that. It's the fact that we don't collaborate and work together to bring people through the system in appropriate ways. And so this system, I think, is quite unique in the ability to do that because it operates as a whole. And so I would say that one of the short-term goals that I would see is, in addition to really operating as a whole and putting educational attainment as a priority, is to pilot new approaches to STEM-based learning in particular, but also just skills-based education more broadly. We focus a lot on degrees, which is appropriate. But if you disaggregate degrees and take it down to the atomic level of fundamental skills and do that in the education system, do it in terms of you as an individual, do it in terms of an employer, you see a completely different picture than you do if, oh, I have a degree in X. Well, that's fine, but what can you actually do? What are your skills? What are your capabilities? What are your attributes? How well are you at all of those things? And knowing our bench strength as well, which is very, very important in Louisiana, given the educational attainment. So a short-term goal for me would be to look at that framework and strengthen it in terms of a seamless framework, but also then to set some very specific goals. For example, I understand in the data I looked at that 8% of the folks, at least in central Louisiana, have associate degrees. I'd like to see that go to 40%. This system is uniquely positioned to do that. Bachelor degrees, 20%, it ought to be about 50%, because lifting up that educational attainment in Louisiana is going to mean economic development. It's going to mean improvement in quality of life. It's going to mean attracting industry and developing new industry. And that's really the foundational piece. So that would be my focus on the education dimension. The second one is the services piece. The agriculture center, the health centers, they're already major players. They're doing extraordinary things. But I noticed that Louisiana does not have an NCI designated cancer center. And the citizens of Louisiana depend greatly on the health sciences organizations there in the LSU system. So suppose that we got the Feist-Weiler Center together with the Willis-Knighton Center, and we created a partnership where we could actually pursue an NCI designation, which would mean upping the research game substantially in R01 grants and so on and so forth. And also with the agricultural and extension activities, you have linkages to every parish. So the connective tissue is there, and it's extraordinarily important for the economy of Louisiana. But also when you look at the future of land grant institutions, you think about technology, you think about rural development and those kinds of things, where you don't change the culture of the rural community, but you bring them into capabilities that they desire to have, but to not lose their identity as rural communities. I think the Louisiana system, LSU system is well suited to do that as well. Also things like food safety, biosecurity, classified research in some of these areas, top line priorities for the nation certainly as well. And I think this is true as also for the biosecurity and biotechnology center. Then finally, research. $350 million of research is really an extraordinarily good amount. But I think it's indicative probably of unrealized opportunity. I think the first Louisiana plan that I read is really good. It's got a great scaffolding framework. And I think that the research plan that I saw for the LSU system is equally good. But I think we all really focus also on things like artificial intelligence, quantum, biotechnology, advanced manufacturing. These are national priorities that are going to be around for a very long time, very large amounts of investment in them, and they really resonate with important key parts of the Louisiana economy. So making sure that we focus on those kinds of things and build them into what is already there. I think averaging EPS score in new directions is very important as well. And there are some changes that we could drive nationally, I think, at LSU, which has been quite successful in EPS score activities. And so I think fully leveraging the capabilities of that full system and bringing in partners. I've worked with Chris Delia, Dean Delia, on partnerships with NOAA and research partnerships. I think a lot of unrealized potential exists there. So a lot of great things are happening, Dr. Gonzalez, but I think this framework that exists is quite unique to be able to do things and fundamentally become the national role model for organizations that don't have this as all part of a same system, but could build the linkages across organizations, even if they're not in the same administrative framework.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Nelson?
Good morning. You've
Good morning.
addressed this question a little bit already, but could you please describe your leadership style with emphasis on hiring, delegation, and decision-making?
Sure. Thank you so much for the good question. as I said, first and foremost, accessibility is critical, as I previously mentioned. When I was at OSTP and so on, I want people to not only be able to access me, but to feel like I am accessible to them in other settings other than just being an officer behind a podium. Those informal relationships are extraordinarily important for developing trust, for building an understanding. When certain situations come up, they know that they can rely on you to engage others, and they really understand where you're coming from. That's terribly important. So accessibility is key. Again, broadly engaging, as I mentioned before, engaging all the constituencies, of which there are many, obviously, in not only in a comprehensive university, but in a system like the LSU system. There's faculty, there's staff, there's students, there's alumni, there's a governor, there's the legislature, there are donors, there's a whole range, private industry, the economic development dimension, local chambers of commerce. They all have a stake in this. And so engaging them, getting them at the table in continuous conversations to figure out where we want to go and to help us actually get there. It's sort of an all hands on deck approach, very, very important. And I really want big ideas. I want disruptive thinking. Don't want people to hold back. And, I don't ever really make decisions based upon the lack of information. The only way you can make good decisions and trust in those decisions is to get a lot of good ideas at the table and work together on them. So getting a lot of eyes on problems is very, very important, as well as making sure that all voices are heard, especially folks that tend to sometimes be thought of as disruptive. Sometimes they can have the most creative ideas. And I certainly include students in this sense, not as disruptors, but of having wonderful ideas. And when I was at the White House, this President's Council of Advisors in Science and Technology that I chair, every administration has one. And it's traditionally and always been composed of individuals who are sort of mid-career, very well-known, very accomplished scholars. Well, I did something very different, and I had to face some pretty strong headwinds in doing it, but I created a committee of undergraduate students, graduate students, postdocs, and early career non-academic professionals, for example, those who are starting companies early in their career, because those folks hold the keys to the future and they need a seat at the table. So I wanted them to be engaged. And my hope is that this continues because it's never been done before. And let me tell you, those folks were extraordinarily helpful and valuable in all the ideas they brought to the table, things that folks of my vintage would never have thought about. So I thought that was really, really quite helpful. I also, as I mentioned, empower and trust people, and I resource them. I delegate a great deal. And I had to learn to do that. Individual faculty, we run our research groups, and as an executive officer and being at the White House and being on the National Science Board, I had to learn how to delegate and feel comfortable with that. But in doing that, I helped develop other leaders. I helped develop individuals understand their career goals, their objectives, where they want to go with their life, and make sure that they're in positions that really advance their own interests. With regard to hiring people, it's obviously one of the most important things we do, especially tenured faculty. To me, being qualified gets you in the door. But what really gets you the position, in my view, is you've got to have the right personal attributes. You've got to have the right sensibilities about yourself. You've got to have the right attitudes, the right approach, the right work ethic, the right sort of love for an institution. Not just being about yourself, but being about the broader whole, the better whole. And that's really indicative of what we have in the South. The other thing I would say is, and this is sort of very practical in the weeds thing, is we always cast a broad net when we hire people, but it's also extremely important to do a landscape analysis and look around to say, who do we really want to get? And this is certainly important for diversity as well, enhancing diversity, inclusion, and equity. But this is true even for early career faculty hires. Where you look around at the grad students, you know who the really fabulous graduate students are out there, and you really go and encourage them to apply. You don't give them a thing under the table, but you encourage them to apply. And so diversity is really critically important for me. Hiring is critically important. And oftentimes, for example, creating diverse pools, my experience has been people can go through all sorts of training. It doesn't mean I know how to do it. And I've seen this time after time in chairing a lot of search committees myself. So it's extremely important that the leadership of the institution convey this, not only creating the framework and the training, but also model these kinds of behaviors at the institutional leadership level. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Jones, Jessica Jones.
You have seen LSU Title IX issues in too many headlines. How do we make protection of students, faculty, and staff from sexual harassment, discrimination, and assault a hard-line priority for all institutions of the LSU system?
It's a great question and really one of the most important questions I think that we could talk about. First and foremost, in my view, leadership has to be fully engaged and the messaging has to be clear and unambiguous. If you want to make this a top priority, you make it a priority at the top, pure and simple. The messaging has to come from leadership. If that doesn't happen, then there's always a question of, is this something that is really valued by the institutional leadership? So things get lost in translation. And I've been in lots of meetings in the academic environment where the president will convey something to the top vice presidents, the provost, and so on, unambiguously, no problem. Then that gets presented to deans, then it gets to chairs and directors, and then it gets to faculty. And on the way down, it oftentimes, and this is for very understandable reasons, goes from here's something that's really important to, oh my God, here's something we've got to do. Another burden, another thing we've got to deal with. And the reason for that, and it's very understandable, is it loses its context. It becomes a message of the stuff versus the stuff in the context in which it was presented. This is a very, very difficult thing, and it's something that is critically important in the messaging. So messaging and messaging from the top and making it a top priority in the leadership is the first and foremost thing. The second thing I think that is so important is all of the things that have to be backed up with actions, okay? Tangible actions, resources, personnel, sort of the mechanistic things. This was highlighted in the report, right? Training and other kinds of things. And being in the office of the president, it's very, very important that it be directly in the leadership right at the top. The same is true for diversity. And it wasn't clear to me that that was the case for the Office of Diversity, but it should be. And I would certainly make sure that it is. But the third point is that in addition to all that stuff, all that training and so on, I'm convinced, and I've seen this myself, that going to a 2-hour webinar or going through training sessions fundamentally will not change the behavior of individuals who are given to certain types of behaviors. Now, you don't necessarily expect the training to change the individual, but you expect it to change their behavior. And that typically is not going to happen for a lot of people. So you need a third thing. And what you need is an institutional culture that reinforces continuously the training, the messaging, and it basically models these things throughout the institution. And so it has to become part of the institution's DNA. So when you think about my university, University of Oklahoma, everybody thinks about football. You think about LSU, you think about athletics, you think about football, you think about, for me, I think about LIGO. You think about lots of things. This has to be one of them that, frankly, when you think about the institution, you think about, oh yes, that's the institution that not only has a great athletics program, but it's an institution that has the culture of these kinds of very positive behaviors. And frankly, I would say it this way, and this is maybe going a little bit out on a limb, but I would say it like this. People ought to feel as uncomfortable thinking about doing something that is of harassing nature, of sexual harassment, other type of harassment. They ought to feel as uncomfortable at that kind of a thing in the LSU environment, in the entire system, as they would feel being in a place of worship and swearing or yelling in a library. The environment ought to be one of respect, almost, one of like, being at the Arizona Memorial, where you're very quiet and you realize this is almost a place of just, of tremendous respect and deep gratitude. And that's what a university needs to be. So that culture is incredibly important. So those would be the things that I feel need to happen. It has to be at the top. There's got to be the structures put in place, but there has to be a continual reinforcement throughout the institution, up and down the line, to where the culture of the institution fundamentally changes to where when you go there, you sense that that culture is pervasive and that you will simply not want to do something that would embarrass the institution, embarrass yourself.
Thank you.
Mr. LaVoy.
Good morning.
Good morning.
How would you ensure that LSU campuses remain student-centered? Please describe how you would interact and engage with students, specifically in the area of fostering student success. How would you incorporate student input and respond to their needs, concerns?
Great, thank you so much. Universities do lots of things. A lot of folks don't understand the totality of what universities do, but we do lots and lots of things. But we fundamentally exist first and foremost for students. End of story. That's it. We wouldn't be here were it not for the students. Now, it's not to say that faculty aren't valuable, staff aren't valuable, and so on, but basically everything flows from students. So to me, they are the center of the university universe. As I mentioned, I've interacted with thousands of students over my career. And part of the reason I put this student group in PCAST is because of their intellectual energy, their enthusiasm, their creativity. So they, to me, are the center of my life. That's why I've been at a university for 36 years. Okay, that's great. But what do we actually do with that? So I begin my interaction with students by listening to them. And I always want to hear about their goals and dreams. I've done this to my graduate students. I've done it with high school students who cold called me and contacted me, one of whom basically was very interested in weather, and he's now working on his PhD here. And I sort of took him under my wing with a colleague of mine, and we sort of mentored him through, and he's a very, very smart kid. But I want to interact with students and know what their dreams are. And you say, well, a university president can't do that one-on-one. There are lots of ways that a university president can interact with students. And if you don't do that, frankly, to me, you're not really valuing the core of what a university is. I also want to help guide students along, and whether it's in the classroom or giving talks to fourth grade classes, which I've done a lot of, or things like that, really making sure that I understand where students are at, what their challenges are, because they change, right? Students that were students when I went to school are very different than the challenges, that is, are very different than the challenges that students face today. And as I mentioned, getting their voices at the table. Meeting with students, they come to the White House. I'd spend a lot of time with students. And I think some people kind of found that surprising. It's like, well, this is the future generation. Why would you not do that? So I interact with students in a lot of different ways, but I love the informal interactions as well as the formal. And that certainly would be a priority for me, priority one, among many priorities as president of LSU. But what do students need to actually be successful? LSU has a wide array of student services, obviously from things like advising and counseling and career counseling and financial aid and certainly student mental health and student support is very, very important. Student organization, student government. Those are all fundamentally critical, not only to the institution, but to help develop leaders as students. Student leaders are the future of our country. So that's very, very important for universities. So I, as president, would be continuously engaged with students, formally and informally, basically hanging out with them. This is one thing I found that it was kind of strange at the White House as a so-called principal. If I just went to a meeting to hang out with a bunch of researchers, I was like, wow, they're going to notice you're there. Well, look, I'm a professor. I'm a scientist. I'm a researcher. I'm a faculty member. I don't want to be viewed differently. I want to hang out with people because by hanging out with them, you learn where they're at, what their challenges are, and so on. So students can't know a president without being engaged with an individual. Students are facing incredible challenges these days, as we all know. But it's all about people and getting the right people in place. So we have great services, but the question is, do we have the kinds of service, the people in those services that are serving the needs of the students? Are they treating them properly? Are they really engaging them? Are they giving them an easy path, or are they mentoring them in ways in terms of courses to take or challenges and to overcome? Are they really helping them solve their problems? And that's really, really critical. So to me, making sure that the right people are in those positions to help in student services, the structures are in place, and being very relational. So I think, when a president loses touch with some of the core elements of a university, the faculty, the students, the alumni, and so on, they've kind of abdicated their right to be a president of that institution. That's not something I would ever do. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Mitchell.
Good morning.
Morning.
Tell us how you would approach leading and working with faculty. What are your views of faculty governance? Please describe your previous experience in leading, supporting, and/or growing research and scholarly activity.
Well, thank you for that very much. So I've been a professor my whole career. I've done a lot of research. I've done a lot of teaching, and I still teach. When I became Associate VP for Research and then VP for Research, the one thing I told the faculty was, don't consider me as some aloof administrator. I'm still one of you. I'm still a professor. I want to interact with you. I want you to see me first and foremost as a professor, and second as a vice president for research. And one of the things that I mentioned before is I know people who know how to solve big problems. They identify problems, but they also help solve them. They're very creative, and they're called faculty. So I lean on faculty very, very heavily, not only to identify problems, but to work out solutions with me. So basically, the first thing that I do is by engaging with faculty is being one of them. And I want them, again, to see me as a professor first and then president a second. Live in their world, teach every semester, understand their concerns, and so on. Visiting their labs, their studios, attending their rehearsals, going to productions. Very, very important to me. I enjoy that. And it's part of what being a president is about. It's not a requirement. It's a gift that one gets when they have the privilege of being a professor. Also, engaging the faculty in university governance is critical. There are formal mechanisms to do this, the faculty senate. But some of the best input comes from faculty by just hanging out with them. And I did this a lot as vice president for research. I'd have informal lunches where 5 or 6 people, we just get together and we talk, and I'd say, look, this is all off the record. Tell me what's bugging you. What walls are you hitting? What is frustrating you? What's keeping you from being successful? I created research liaisons in every department. I met with the faculty senate, awards committees, and things like that to express my value to the faculty. And also as a physical scientist, when I became a VP for research, I wanted to convince the arts, fine arts, and humanities that I was a champion for their scholarship. And that wasn't always the case, hasn't always been the case. And I was able to do that. It took a little while, and simply because I wasn't in that domain. But after a while, they began to realize that I saw a university as a comprehensive institution where all disciplines and scholarly areas are equally valued. And so that's something to me is very, very important in terms of faculty trusting you and involving them in the governance activities. And of course, like I said, they're very important in governance. Now, with regard to research, if I address your question there adequately, of course, I spent a lot of my career being involved with research and then also as a research leader. So as I mentioned, I was 4 years as Associate VP for Research at OU and then 9 years as the Vice President for Research. But even before I held those more formal roles, I grew research as a professor in ways that helped transform the institution. We had a science technology center. I co-founded this in 1988. I was 3 years at OU as an assistant professor. And man, this thing, I'll tell you, it sort of throws you in the deep end, right? You're working with significant administrative problems, complex budgets, engaging private industry, K-12, diversity enhancement, multiple disciplines, aligning people to address challenges that everyone wants to go forward and sort of hit the same point and with the same goal. So I did that sort of thing. And OU had to put in place a lot of things that didn't exist. It was really a wake-up call to, hey, we've got to get really creative. We've never done this before. So that was one way I did that. American Airlines, I had a big project with them in the mid-90s that, let me tell you, they had attorneys that were real closers. They knew what they were doing in negotiating contracts. We not so much. So we, out of that, created an intellectual property organization that was our commercialization and licensing function and so on and so forth. And that happened based on a research project. So part of what I did early in my career, outside of being a formal research leader, was try to help build the institution. It happened in creating the National Weather Center here at the university, which is kind of the teaching hospital concept of bringing together researchers and operational practitioners and the actual teaching activities, all of that together in the same facility, which has been quite successful. And as I mentioned, as a VPR, I basically engaged all disciplines. But when I became VPR, I sort of opened the eyes of the folks in the VPR office, and I said, we are completely unprepared to grow the research of the institution because we're way undersized. So I started growing very carefully and thoughtfully and engaging the faculty the whole way. So they knew I wasn't building some type of, big operation there, with growing the enterprise in ways that would help empower the faculty to be more successful in their scholarship. And so I created a research analysis group to look at statistical data, which we didn't do before. We created a Center for Research Program Development and Enrichment that helped faculty learn how to write competitive grant proposals and build collaborative teams and so on. We built a research campus. We achieved Carnegie R1 status and lots of other things that really helped move the institution forward. And so this has been really a core of what I have done, but I learned a lot by being an executive officer and working with other parts of the university, including athletics, certainly in academics, the legal counsel, export controls, compliance, fundraising, and so on. It was all part of those enterprises because research really is not something that should sit in isolation. It truly is something that should be integrated throughout the institution in every dimension of the academic enterprise.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question is from Chancellor Clark.
Good morning.
Good morning.
In a time of limited and even shrinking resources, budgeting and resource allocations are important responsibilities. Budget cuts to higher education have resulted in many unfilled faculty and staff positions, lagging salaries, fewer graduate students, and higher tuition and overhead fees. How can the LSU system begin to address some of these inequities over the next 5 years without assuming higher budgets?
It's a very, very good question. In fact, in 2012, when I was on the National Science Board, we issued a report that looked at public funding for higher education and did a real deep dive into that. And what we found was quite troubling, is exactly the sort of thing that you mentioned. And here we are, 9 years later, and we're still facing challenges. In fact, the challenges are even greater now. With the COVID pandemic, of course, it's changed some of the attitudes of students toward when they might attend college. So that sort of flow into the academic enterprise is fundamentally different. What will perhaps free two-year colleges mean for our enterprise, especially the LSU system, which has a very important piece of that in its system? Online versus residential learning, what's that going to look like going forward? I'm obviously not intimately familiar with the budgets and the priorities and the financial obligations of LSU, but I want to tell you one thing. I place really high priority on personnel, because everything flows from people. And of course, obviously, if you look at the budgets of virtually any university, and this is true for the LSU system, by and large, the bulk of the budget goes toward people. So it's critically important to hire and retain the most outstanding faculty and staff you can, because from that flows success in scholarly activities, in teaching, research, facilities, and institutional reputation, and also impact for the state, impact for the nation. And it also creates an environment where people not only feel value, but in fact, they are valued. And to really kind of underscore that point, I noticed that was, I believe, a couple of days ago, that one of your outstanding faculty, Nancy Rabalis of the College of Coast and the Environment, she was elected to the National Academy of Sciences. That is a big deal, as you know, and it really reflects, I think, the importance of what I'm talking about here, of personnel, of the core of what a university is about, including our graduate students. So let me give you a few specific thoughts. With regard to actions that one can take, there are obviously a finite number of well-known options. The first one, of course, is increasing resources from non-appropriated funds. Philanthropy, increasing tuition, auxiliary services, increasing research, and so on. Some of those things are easier to do than others. So that's on the one side of the ledger, increasing. Obviously, reducing costs is on the other side, through restructuring, through cost shifting, through efficiency, outsourcing, and so on. And I would add a third leg to that stool, if stool has to have three legs, and that would be leveraging of funding from multiple sources, strategic partnerships at the institutional level. This is something I push very, very strongly when I was in the White House, that we don't tend to do in academia as much as we should in a variety of ways, and we can talk about that more if you like. Second, LSU has experienced a lot of cuts. So a lot of things I just mentioned, I know have been well considered and debated and so on and so forth. But I'll be honest with you, bringing in a new president is an inflection point in the history of an institution, because it's an opportunity to maybe address certain things that you couldn't otherwise address were you not bringing somebody in from the outside, for example. And I would include state appropriations in this. I know your question said don't consider them, and I'm not, but I wouldn't write that off as an option for a new president coming in to say, let's articulate a really bold, transformative vision for the LSU system, for the state of Louisiana, and how this impacts the nation and the world. Not that that hasn't been done, but there's a new opportunity when you bring new leadership in to do that perhaps in different ways. And the third point I would make is, and this goes back to Dr. Gonzalez's comment, that LSU as a system provides really greater flexibility and opportunity to address some of the budget challenges. Now, let me be very careful in how I say this, because I'm not talking about, for example, robbing Peter to pay Paul and saying, okay, well, we're going to disadvantage part of the system over here at the expense of growing a part of another system, part of the other system over here at the expense of another one. What I'm saying is that this system is very broad in its capabilities. And what that means is, when you think about a donor base, for example, you have a great many number of opportunities to find engagement points for donors into the system. It might be K-12, it might be 2-year, it might be 4-year, it might be comprehensive research university, the LSU flagship campus, it might be in the healthcare arena. So it's not just one institution that has a certain number of things. It's multiple institutions that are a multiple framework that provides a huge opportunity to bring in funding from the outside, not just donors, but from corporate engagement and so on, as partnerships. And that is really powerful. So I think that's one of the sort of the X factors that I see that the LSU system has. And finally, I would say, and obviously this is true, you can't address everything at once. So you need a plan over time. There's some things that are imperatives, top-notch, top-line priorities. There's other things that you can do in parallel, other things that you maybe start, but you ramp up more slowly, and other things you simply have to defer. But the bottom line is, I think for example, from a donor perspective, LSU has really got to provide a bold, compelling narrative that really sets it apart from other institutions. And part of me, I don't want to be part of an institution that simply blends in. I want to be part of an institution that wants to stand out and really stand out in a leadership role, not only in the state, but also in the nation. And I think the Louisiana system provides a huge opportunity to do that. So the challenges that we face budgetarily, I think, frankly, are opportunities to leverage the strengths we have and think creatively in ways that perhaps we haven't before.
Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Smith?
Good morning. Please discuss your commitment to and experience enhancing diversity, including diversity as it relates to underrepresented groups, as well as diversity of thought, experience, et cetera.
Thank you very much. Great question. Diversity is something that I've worked on my entire career at a variety of levels as a faculty member with individual grants, center activities, the National Science Board, also at the White House. So I had an actual committee that was looking at diversity, in particular, safe and inclusive research environments. And so it's something that's really a core part of who I am. And I define a diversity very, very broadly. Age, sex, gender, ethnicity, geography, veterans, rural persons with disability, rural, urban, so on and so forth, viewpoints, disruptive thoughts, big risk-taking, intellectually risky ideas, and so on, and bringing diversity into equity and inclusion as well. And it's sort of part of my heart to do this is because fundamentally, being from Kansas, living a long time in Oklahoma, and being part of the Midwest, I believe that a lot of areas of our country get overlooked and they're marginalized. And so my heart is to make sure that everybody can be included, everybody has a voice, everybody has an opportunity, and everybody is respected. So that's first and foremost. Second thing is, pure and simple, diversity leads to better outcomes. And you don't need studies, you sort of know this, but there have been studies that clearly have shown that. So there are really sort of three phases, I would say, in my work with diversity. I mentioned a faculty member as research organization leader in national policy. But let me tell you that the one thing, and I'll just be very honest with you, I sort of did diversity early on in my career, but it wasn't until over time I really learned how to do it. And I learned more deeply what it meant and how to actually not just say, oh yeah, diversity is important and yeah, we're doing these certain things, but how to actually make tangible, meaningful improvements in diversity by drawing people in rather than simply moving them around. So it's something, diversity, equity, inclusion, I've learned over time. I'm still learning, I'm still getting better at it, but it's something we all need to have become a part of it. So as a faculty member, as I mentioned, individual grants, my own department has a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee. Work that I've done, presentations I've given, REU site programs. I graduated the first Black American Master's recipient in my department here at the university. He's now finished his PhD and moved on to great things in Washington, D.C. So at the sort of individual grant level, that's sort of where I cut my teeth. But as an organizational leader, for example, when I started this center in the late 1980s, I hired a Native American individual to be the education outreach coordinator because I saw in him special capabilities and frankly gave him an opportunity that nobody else seemed willing to give him. And he now has a PhD and he's on the faculty at the University of Missouri. So it's not about achieving just the goals of diversity, but it's about helping other people go take their diversity activities and implant them other places. Various centers I've led have certainly done that, but more close to home at OU, I created a diversity committee on the Office of the Vice President for Research. Various committees I've chaired, making sure that they are diverse themselves, but also develop and create diverse pools of candidates. I created a position in the VPR office. We called it the diversity and research position, but we changed it later to be broader impacts in research, of which diversity is a very critical part. And that was something that didn't exist at my university. And it's now something, and not because I did it, but something that has really grown broadly across the country. I've worked with our advanced program, the Includes program at APLU, led the EPSCoR strategic plan here in Oklahoma. And one of my colleagues, who was my executive associate VPR at OU, I nominated her to be on the NSF Committee on Equal Opportunity in Science and Engineering, and she is now the vice chair of that committee, and helping at a national level, working closely with Congress to improve diversity. So it's not just about doing diversity yourself; it's about creating capabilities in other individuals and sending them out, which universities do very well, to make impacts on diversity. And then, of course, in national policy, I was on the National Science Board and chaired a task force on cost sharing. You might say, well, how is that diversity? Well, because previously, the National Science Foundation allowed basically institutions to cost share on grants without sort of any limitations. What that meant was that in some cases, well-resourced institutions could essentially put a lot of money on the table and create disadvantage for institutions and organizations that weren't as well-resourced. So we basically said, no, there's no cost sharing allowed unless it's fundamental to the core purposes of the program. What that did was it leveled the playing field across institutions. It meant you had to compete on merits, not on your ability to buy your way into grants. As I mentioned also, the Joint Committee on the Research Environment I established when I was at the White House in OSTP. We had a committee called SIRE, the Safe and Inclusive Research Environment. So look very broadly at issues of inclusion and belonging and equity across the entire, this is in the context of research, the research enterprise, but primarily the academic enterprise. Our plan for a STEM education for the nation that we put out of OSTP, one of the 3 pillars was enhancing diversity in the entire STEM education enterprise. And so also in committees that I had influence on in the White House of their makeup, for example, PCAST, bringing in somebody who was the chief technology officer of Bank of America. You wouldn't think, well, she's not a scientist. Well, that's the point, right? You want diversity of thought, diversity of viewpoints, and so on and so forth. And the same is true for the National Science Board. So, you know, with regard to LSU, you have a diversity office, but I want to make sure that people don't see that office as solely owning making sure diversity happens. It needs to be, and I'm not saying it's not, but I'm saying it needs to be the coordinating mechanism that makes sure that diversity is woven throughout and not just, okay, now that we have an office, they're taking care of it and it absolves me as a faculty member, as a staff member from thinking about diversity or understanding diversity or making it happen. So, so thank you for that very, very good question. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Ms. Slaughter?
Thank you. COVID-19 has dramatically impacted campus and daily life. What are your thoughts for fall semester 2021 and beyond for extended or new COVID protocols?
Yeah, great question. I was in the absolute midst of the COVID response as a member of the president's coronavirus task force. And so part of my role then as OSTP director, I engaged the academic community. I talked a lot about engagement. Here's another example. By meeting and having large conference calls with presidents and chancellors of universities, vice presidents for research, with deans of medical colleges, with professional societies up and down the line to understand what the challenges were. Because I wasn't boots on the ground, I was actually at the White House, so I wasn't in the midst of it, you know, at a university. So I really wanted to understand what are the issues you're dealing with, and how can we help you? How can we help delay reports? How can we roll back compliance requirements? How can we provide funding and other kinds of mechanisms, working with the Office of Management and Budget? How can we make sure that we are alleviating as much pressure on you that right now is not necessary, so that you can focus on addressing issues at that time of closing down laboratories, of getting classes online, and so on and so forth. So those are all very important things. And I think, you know, it's critical to realize that obviously the COVID pandemic has been a horrible thing, but it also, I think, has allowed us to see that we can do things in certain ways that we didn't realize that we could do, you know, get a vaccine in less than 12 months. So, you know, I want to take those lessons learned and not go back to where we were. I want to go back to a better place of greater efficiency, greater collaboration, greater focus on sort of shared goals, shared vision, shared values. And I think that's going to be extraordinarily important for universities. Now, the coronavirus, of course, we call it the novel virus. And so we learn a lot more about it every day. And your question is a very important one because it impacts really the totality of where we're going as an institution. Now, as I mentioned, and you're not asking me to make a decision or take a stand, and I certainly would not do that without engaging other folks in the conversation in the LSU system, state epidemiologists, and lots of other stakeholders in this. But I will tell you that many universities are going back to full classes, fully in-person classes in the fall semester, my own university included, with appropriate safety protocols in place. And it's important that we do that. So my hope, in answering your question, is my hope is that we would at LSU get back to fully open, fully in-person classes in the fall semester. That would be my hope, and hopefully, certainly my expectation, but temper that certainly with making sure that we are taking the right steps in the right way and making informed decisions, and not some unilateral decision that is not considering all the facts. But I think the numbers are looking very, very good. I track them constantly. I stay very much in touch with what's happening. I learned a lot about epidemiology and a lot about things that I knew very little about before. And as a president science advisor, you sort of have to be conversant in a lot of things. And so I'm certainly no expert, but I do know where the experts are, and I know how to talk with them. And so this is certainly something I would hope that at LSU in the fall term, we could go back fully open, fully in-person classes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question is from Mr. Cazalet.
Dr. Droegemeier, you've touched on philanthropy in some of your prior responses, but would you discuss your fundraising experience and perhaps any thoughts you've got on additional revenue generation opportunities? And to the extent you can, would you give us some specific examples?
Sure, absolutely. Well, as I mentioned, my interaction with, I'll be very crude and say asking people for money. It's obviously, that's a very pejorative way to say it, because it's a very deep thing when you especially engage alumni and others. You share a bold vision for the institution, which is a very exciting thing for me to do. And what I love about fundraising in whatever dimension it takes, whether it's for research or whatever else, I love getting people excited about something. I love talking to them about my own views of it, how its impact will be on the institution, what its impact will be for the state, what the impact will be for the nation, for individual people that they've never met and will never even know that this work was being done. That is one of the most exciting things for me that I do. So I've done a lot of that over the years, and I'll give you some specific examples. And some of this is very sort of direct fundraising activity. Some is a little bit more indirect. For example, the indirect part would be like giving talks at alumni groups. The president, David Boren, would always have me do this because people get excited about weather. They understand weather. That's my area. I would get them excited about what's happening here in Norman with the Oklahoma, we call it now the National Weather Center, all the activities here, the private companies that we were starting and creating. And it really would juice the alumni and say, wow, I really want to invest in that. I see where you're going. I see the value. I want to create and fund an endowed chair. Let's do this. And in fact, in my own department, we have something like 6 endowed chairs, which is really unheard of for programs like this. And it really comes down to telling a story, telling a good story, and then helping the individual, for example, a donor, see how their resources will impact the particular unit to which they are directed, how they will impact the people there, how they will meet the desires and the goals of the donor, and then have broader impacts across the institution and across the state and even the nation. So that's sort of how I get excited about fundraising, because I think it's fun to do, and it's certainly a challenge. Some of the more specific examples, the project I mentioned with American Airlines back in the mid-1990s, we saw an opportunity to create a professorship since it was a weather-related project, and of course, weather is very important to aviation, to create an endowed professorship at American Airlines. So I was working with the executive vice president of American at the time, and I wrote a letter in a sort of a one-pager vision piece for this thing, and wrote a letter for our president to send to this individual. And so we engaged in a conversation, and I think it was actually AMR Corporation, the parent, donated $250,000 to establish an endowed professorship in that arena in my department. Private company that I started, Weather Decision Technologies, when we sort of developed the business plan, we were going around selling the idea of this company to a variety of investors. So it's a little bit different sort of dimension of fundraising, but it was very important because this is a technology company, a weather technology company that was taking the completely novel work we were doing and putting it in a commercial environment. And the sort of the proof of concept was done at American Airlines, but there were many sectors: the energy sector, the manufacturing sector, the construction sector, transportation, and so on, that were heavily dependent upon this kind of technology. So went out and talked to a lot of leaders in those sectors, gathering input and also trying to convince people to invest in that. I also was heavily involved in other endowed chair recruitment efforts. Williams Energy Marketing and Trading was a big company, or is a big company in Oklahoma, in Tulsa. It was sort of like an Enron type company, though it didn't suffer, fortunately, the fate of Enron. But it had the largest energy trading floor west of the Mississippi. Huge enterprise. And so we had a massive project with them and that I led and created and led. And so they funded a chair in my department called the Williams Chair in Energy. And it was really about how you use weather and climate forecasting for energy futures and trading and so on. So I was involved with sort of creating the vision for that and seeing it through. The McCaslin Chair in my department as well, another endowed chair in meteorology. The donor was a pilot, and he was very interested in this. So I explained to him, obviously, the importance of weather and what we did, very critical. The Corix, OU, just like LSU, we outsourced the management of our utilities to a private company, and Corix is the name of the company. And so they were very much into environmental sustainability and green things and so on and so forth, and energy efficient buildings. And so we said, hey, this is a perfect opportunity for us to endow a chair in that area, which they ended up doing. And I chaired the search for that position and filled it. From a building point of view, we have a sort of our first building on our big research campus where we built 1 million square feet in less than 10 years. We have private companies, we have academic buildings and so on. The anchor building to that was funded by Charlie and Peggy Stevenson. They were in oil and gas. And so I met with them. Multiple people met with them to explain to them the value of this, and they donated a very sizable gift, which was then we fundraised for that, and then also matching support from the state to actually build that building. And that really got our research campus going, was the anchor. My most recent activity in fundraising was with a private family, actually a Canadian family, who donated $3 million to establish a nonprofit foundation, a nonprofit organization that worked on the social behavioral science dimensions of weather and climate. Because at the end of the day, all the technology in the world doesn't keep people from dying. You got to understand the human dimension. They were quite interested in that. So I secured a $3 million gift from them. So I've had a lot of experience. There were other things I was involved with. I would say a little bit less directly. I was part of the team, but these are the ones that I sort of had a leadership role in. And certainly David Boren, who was our previous president, was a master at fundraising. He basically held the reins of a lot of the engagement with, as presidents typically do, with philanthropy. And so he would call me in various opportunities to bring in my knowledge of the institution, but also of the weather enterprise when the time was appropriate. So, I have to say, I was a little surprised to see that the endowment at LSU was less than $1 billion. Not that that's anything to sneeze at. It's a very, very impressive number. I guess I just sort of look at OU and find that we, David Boren, raised over $2 billion. And so I think there's a huge opportunity there. And as I said, fundraising and philanthropy and talking with donors and alumni really excites me, because it's a huge opportunity to tell the LSU story, which I think is a compelling story, to get them excited. And as I said before, see how they could plug in and be part of this tremendous history, but also going forward a part of the institution. And there's great areas for that, as I mentioned before. I think certainly in the medical arena, if we think about NCI designation for cancer as an enterprise, energy, agriculture, biotechnology, advanced manufacturing, lots of areas to really get donors excited about, but also fundraising from the private sector in partnerships. And I mentioned institutional level engagement there. It's great to have deans and chairs and other faculty talk to private companies. They absolutely should do that. But there's nothing like a president meeting with the head of a major corporation to talk about strategic alignment, to set the umbrella framework for other activities that can happen underneath. If you sort of start from down below, getting to the top of an organization to really do substantial things takes a long time. So articulating the values of the institution, the common touch points and so on is very important. That's really, I think, a unique opportunity for the president and the senior leadership team, but especially the president.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Immediate past Chair Mary Werner.
Thank you. Good morning, Professor Droegemeier.
Good morning.
Good morning. What is your vision for the success of LSU athletics and its role in the holistic development of student athletes?
Well, as you might imagine, being at the University of Oklahoma, athletics is pretty important. But I have to tell you, I came to OU as an undergraduate for two reasons. First of all, it was 5 hours south of where I grew up. A very, very good meteorology program. It wasn't very big at the time, but had the National Severe Storms Laboratory here, and it was really one of the key centers of action. So that drew me to OU. The second thing was Sooner football. I was a huge OU fan, had been for a long, long time. And so it was a perfect storm that I went here. I absolutely love everything about collegiate athletics. Look, it's just plain exciting. Anybody that's been to a tailgate party or gone to any basketball games, gone to track meets, gone to whatever activities they have across the board, softball, baseball, you name it. I mean, collegiate athletics is great. I used to really love a lot of pro athletics. I don't so much anymore. They've lost their shine. There's just too much craziness going on there, with all due respect. collegiate athletics are much more pure. They're much more driven by competition, and they're just so special. They also do an incredible job of developing leaders. They're a key part of an institution's history and culture. And it's certainly true at the University of Oklahoma, and it's absolutely true at LSU. And it also links multiple generations. I mean, think of homecoming. Think of all the stories that people tell about when they went to athletic events, especially football games, and then they come back, you see the alumni band marching. Those are relationships that are incredibly important. And just for fundamental reasons of being part of an institutional family. Now, more selfishly, you could say, well, it helps them, stay engaged, to be donors and things like that. Sure, it does all of that. But fundamentally, it's simply part of the institutional culture. The athletic enterprise is also an exceptionally challenging, it's a very complex environment. And a lot of folks external to the institution and even internal, they don't understand it. They sort of think all money is green. And that, why are we investing a lot of money into athletics? Well, they're self-sustaining enterprises. And one interesting point that I would just say is kind of a fun anecdote. Bob Gates, who was a former president of Texas A&M, CIA director, and also the Secretary of Defense, he gave a commencement address at OU a number of years ago, actually when he was Secretary of Defense. And he said something that was really funny, I'll never forget. He said, a CIA director, I found it much easier to overthrow a small country than as a president of Texas A&M to fire a football coach. I thought, well, that's a truism, right? So it's joking around a little bit, but I think the one thing I would say is that the institution that I'm at right now reflects my deep views about collegiate athletics. It's about celebrating the athletic and the academic skills of our student athletes, the scholarly skills, the things that they achieve. We place very high expectations on them. They're in the limelight all the time, but we also place high expectations on them in terms of character. That's the top job. And I tell you, it really flows from leadership. We have in Joe Castiglione, our athletic director, an extraordinary individual. I think Joe's been here more than 20 years. He's done a superb job of setting a tone at this university, which wasn't always the case, okay? You go back to our history, you know that we've been through challenging times. That wasn't always the case, but with him and David Bourne's leadership, they really created an environment, I think, that truly everyone can be proud of, and that really reflected the fundamental heartbeat of the institution as an institution of deep values, of culture, of respect, and intolerance towards certain types of behaviors. And frankly, the results speak for themselves. So we set a very high bar and we enforce standards. That's it. It doesn't mean things don't happen, right? It certainly doesn't mean, but it means that there are no systemic issues. And that to me is the most important thing. The flip side is really true as well. Our athletic leaders, our coaches, they value academics. They give time and money to our academics. They even fund scholarships. In fact, Sherry Cole, who just stepped down as our head women's basketball coach, huge supporter of the library, financially and otherwise. That sends an important message to our student athletes, to our other athletes, to say, you know what, we're all part of the same family. Athletics is important. It's not the tail that's wagging a dog. We're all part of the same university family. So in my view, a successful athletic program, it obviously develops the athlete, it develops the individual, it develops the leaders, it develops communication skills, it engages them in service activities. But the one thing I think that's very important here is to celebrate the special gifts that the athletes have, but also to make sure that they and everyone understands that every student at a university has special gifts. There are high achievers everywhere. They're called Goldwater scholars. They're called, recipients of national awards. They're called degree recipients. They're McNair scholars. They're all over the place. We need to celebrate the achievements of everyone, because in that way, you avoid creating resentment. You realize you're building the leadership of everyone. You're giving everyone opportunity, and you're seeding into the lives of individuals who are going to go out and become not only great alumni of the institution, reflect the values of the institution, but they become really fabulous, engaged citizens of our nation. Athletics is really big at LSU, just like it is at OU. I love that. I love that fact. OU's gone through tough times in the past. LSU is going through a bit of a rough time right now. LSU will emerge stronger than it was before, just like OU did. I'm absolutely committed to making that happen.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have right at 10 minutes left. In the last 10 minutes, what questions do you have for us as a committee?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Really, again, appreciate all the great work you do. just a few questions that we have time for here. Apart from the Title IX work and obviously focusing on budgets and urgent personnel matters and so on, and certainly learning about the system, learning about lots of things. In the first 100 days of a new president's term, what would you say are the top 3 priorities that the president should focus on? Again, exclusive of the things that I mentioned. And would the faculty agree with the things that you're mentioning?
Well, again, I'll turn that on its head a little bit and invite input from the faculty members since you asked that specifically. Don't make me call on somebody.
Okay, I'll help out, but this isn't something that we've practiced, Dr. Droegemeier. So, but I think one of the critical things in the first 100 days is to get around to all of the institutions in the system. The strategic plan that we published, that we talk about right now, really focuses on the flagship campus more than it does the others. I'm not saying that 100 days is a time for the plan, but begin to develop a system-wide vision and direction in that days to get out and listen to all of our different stakeholders and constituents and the people of the Capitol, then begin to form what direction, what vision can we take that will pull us all together. That would be my hope.
Thank you. Very, very helpful. Thank you very much.
Either Ms. Slaughter or Mr. Cazalet, from that sort of perspective, want to give your perspective on
Well,
that
I
question?
would, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would second exactly what Mr. Laborde has said. We have lacked what you called a bold transformative vision for the 8 institution system. And I think starting that process of listening, understanding the needs of all those institutions, building that vision that incorporates the needs, the desires of our students, our faculty, the administration, the state, and donors. To start that process, move that down the road in the first 100 days, I think would create the sort of enthusiasm and excitement that people see big change coming. We need that. You mentioned a low endowment. And our fundraising has suffered because we lack those big ideas, the transformative ideas that excite people. And that's how we can fund research. That's how we can hire new faculty. It's how we can compensate the faculty we've got. We do a great job attracting students, but we've got to run this institution better. And that's going to take strong leadership.
Well, thank you so much for that. And let me reflect on a question that I was going to ask, but I'm not, because you sort of hit the nail on the head. And that is, it's been my experience in going into different positions, vice president for research, when I went to the White House and so on, certain leadership positions. And I've seen this in other cases. Other people have told me they share the same experience, that once you're actually in the door, you learn, or in fact, you're surprised by some things that you wish somebody had told you ahead of time. And that's unavoidable, I think, because frankly, there are certain things you simply can't share. But you have been very open and honest and frank, especially in that last answer, to say that, we need that bold vision. We need that bringing together. And frankly, like I said, one of the things that really attracts me about LSU is the fact that you have this holistic system. You have a K-12 school, for crying out loud, all the way to a doctoral program with agriculture, with medical campuses thrown in, and extension. I mean, you've got basically everything. And this could be the absolute flagship for the nation, a flagship model for the nation. And, you could have said, well, we're doing a lot of great things. We've got a plan. We're ready to go. It's just come in and make it happen. But thank you for being so open and honest to say, we need more. We need that big, bold vision. And that's sort of who I am. And anybody you talk to about me will tell you that. I don't want to be at an institution that just wants to sit still and wants to blend in. And I joke around when I give commencement addresses, everybody's dressed the same. And I say, don't blend in, stand out. You look around you, everybody looks the same. And, LSU doesn't need to blend in. And this is a part of the country, frankly, that I think needs to just, explode. And when I was VP for research, I created this informal sort of grassroots organization all the way from not an organization, but a collective of all the way from the Dakotas to the Gulf Coast. And we got together as vice presidents for research from, 20 some different schools. And we said, what are our common challenges? What are the common problems that we could work on together that are beyond what we could do by ourselves? What congressional delegation horsepower do we have? What companies do we have in the region? It turns out we've got a ton. You got Energy, you got ConAgra, you got Tyson Food, you got all kinds of companies there. We never stopped to think about the Midwest as a framework for doing research and doing big things that frankly could not be done in other parts of the country. And so that's what I want to do. That's what I would like to come to an institution to do. And frankly, I think LSU is really well positioned to do that. If I could very briefly ask another quick question, Mr. Chairman, to you. The Board of Supervisors obviously have been dealing with a lot of challenges with the Title IX situation and so on. I was quite impressed with the report, just how it was done, how it was written, how forthcoming it was, and some of the things that those individuals recognize in writing the report that, hey, people are going to see it this way, but here's why we're doing it the way we're doing it and why we're explaining it and so on. I'm sure that the Board of Supervisors have some important takeaways from this experience, as we all do in experiential learning. We go through things, we learn from it. I was just curious, in terms of your stewardship of this incredible institution, incredible system, what sorts of things, I'm not talking about Title IX specifically, what sorts of other things have you maybe learned about and reflected on in terms of the Board of Supervisors approach to stewarding this enterprise?
As my pastor says, I'm glad you asked the question. That frees me up to give you the answer, because I do think you have asked the critical question in this search. I think if it's one thing that we have learned as a board is that we want to be a part of setting the policy for the system, and then let our enormous and tremendous resources, both natural and intellectual, take over and lead the way and flourish and be as meaningful to the state of Louisiana as LSU is capable of being. And right now, we are excelling in all of our various pockets: academic, research, intellectual, athletic. We're making such strides, but there is a lack of a cohesive mission and vision to bring it all together and showcase it for the world. And if there's anything I think all of the board members have seen, is that we've got more going for us than we even realized. And we've got more going for us than people realize. And we need a leader who can bring it all together, can weave it into a wonderful fabric or a gumbo, or whatever analogy you want to use, and put it on display for the world, so that we can be a light to the world, and we can showcase all that we have to offer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. That's a really terrific answer, and my heart resonates with you, because that's something that I think is eminently doable, and you've got a great foundation upon which to build, and in no way, again, to marginalize what has been done and is being done already. I think it's really extraordinary. One other question, if I might, just ask about diversity. Obviously, it's very, very important. I read the diversity roadmap. I thought it had a lot of really, really good things in there. I just more wanted a clarification here. As I looked at the org chart, I see that there is a vice provost for diversity. And well, let me just say it this way. Does the diversity activity in the leadership report directly to the president, or does it report up through the provost?
It reports up through the provost, but I think that arrangement, like many structural arrangements here at LSU, are worth looking into. I think you've identified an issue on campus that would allow us to more successfully integrate diversity into the overall fabric of the system. So I think that's a very good observation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. And certainly I saw that, diversity in the report, in the plan, I should say, the roadmap, I think it was a 2-year roadmap. I didn't see a whole lot about research in diversity, and research is one of the, I think, extraordinary mechanisms for bringing people together. And this is something I messaged very strongly at the White House and built into a lot of our policies. was when you think about what research does, it inspires fundamentally, whether it's art history, whether it's political science, whether it's electrical engineering. We are inspired by discovering new knowledge. It's really an extraordinary thing. But it also unites us. It brings us together, people of every different persuasion, as diverse as you could possibly imagine. It brings us together to work together in ways where values are fundamental. You don't plagiarize, you don't falsify, you don't fabricate, you don't do things that are wrong. And if you do, then you simply get booted out. And so people don't really think about doing that. But it also guides. There's a dimension of research where scholarly outcome, a painting, for example, expresses someone's values, expresses part of culture, it expresses part of history. You develop a device or something that's going to cure a disease or better detect cancer or whatever. There is this very practical value proposition where it guides us. And certainly science has inspired the country. I think it's united us to address the pandemic, and it's truly guiding us out of the pandemic. And so I would say from a diversity point of view, I would strongly urge that research, the scholarly, I don't mean research just in STEM, but the scholarly dimension of the institution be brought fully into the diversity framework. And I may have overlooked it, so I apologize, but I didn't really see it in there like I maybe thought I would. So anyway, thank you for that. I know we're at the end of the time here. So Mr. Chairman, thank you so much, and all the members of the committee for your hard work, and deeply appreciate the time that you spent with me this morning. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thanks for coming.
Right, go ahead.